Today on the Perception and Action podcast, Perception and Action Journal Club number 22. I'm joined by Tyler Yerby, Nick Seekirk, Marianne Davies, and Dave Caruso to discuss how we can redesign warm-up sessions to make them more representative and better pave the way for motor learning. So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. In today's episode, we had a good discussion about practice warm-up sessions. What should their purpose really be? How can we innovate and redesign them to promote exploration and better motor learning when we get to skill-specific training? Note, near the end, you will hear Tyler describing some videos we were looking at. If you'd like to see them, you can either look up this video on my YouTube channel, or I've linked to them directly in the show notes. Hope you enjoy. Okay, I think we're live. So welcome everyone again to another edition of the Perception and Action podcast. This is the Journal Club, of course. I'm very excited to be joined by a couple of people that you've seen before and a couple of new people as well to talk about. I know we all were just talking about before we went on live. All of us seem to get asked about this a lot. This question about how warm up. What should you do with a warm up? And in this, I think we're going to treat it kind of liberally. You know, warm up could mean what you do at the start of the practice when everyone shows up and on the field or the ice, or kind of the homework you give to your athletes. You know, what do they do in the weight room or off the ice or anything. So we're gonna kind of have an open discussion about this, and you know what we're all about here. I think, and we're trying to do is trying to innovate practice design. So we want to innovate the warm up. I think in here. So, but to start off, I think I'll go around the room and let everybody introduce themselves and tell a little bit about themselves. So I'll start with Dave, is right next to me.
Hey everybody, Dave Caruso. I work with USA Hockey, the national governing body, and coach education manager. Kind of background for me, played hockey growing up and played at the Ohio State University, played pro, coached pro, and then went back and have been living in Columbus for the last couple of years and worked with Ohio State Hockey before starting with the USA Hockey. So really excited to be here. So big fan of you, Rob.
Cool. Dave, did you play roller hockey at all?
I did. I played roller hockey a little bit. That was my second sport. That was my my donor sport coming in.
I think we might have crossed paths. Your name looks familiar, and I'm a face person, so catch up at some point. Yeah,
nice,
awesome.
So I'll go to you, Nick, next. New panelist? Good to have you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation. I look forward to an active discussion. So I'm Nick. I am a professor at Georgia Southern University. So my training is in motor behavior, but I love to study movement, and I want to make people move better, more efficient, and whether that's clinically with neurological disease or on the athletic side of things. I'm excited for what's to come. So,
cool.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. Marianne, a returning panelist.
Hi, good evening here anyway.
Yeah.
Good afternoon where you are. So yeah, Marianne Davies. I am primarily from a sort of adventure sports and equestrian sports background. So I've worked mostly with things like paddle sports, climbing, and other sports like that. I'm currently doing a PhD in skill acquisition in equestrian sports with Keith Davids. And I work with UK coaching as a senior coach developer. So I've worked quite a lot within adventure sports through, sort of working and within that system building as well and coach developments. And I'm a global partner with Emergence. So.
Cool. And this is a good transition to last but not least, Tyler.
I wasn't expecting that, Marianne, but I appreciate the announcement for sure. Yeah, we're excited about it, of course. My name is Tyler Yerby. I'm the co-founder and co-director of education at Emergence. So we're a movement skill education company. And in addition to that, I am pursuing my doctorate in skill acquisition as well, under the direction of Will Roberts and Keith Davids as my external at the University of Gloucestershire. So just about 2.5 hours west of London. It is being done virtually for the most part. And then my day-to-day, I work with athletes ranging from 8 years of age up to professional athletes, primarily team sports, American football. So my doctorate will be in skill acquisition, but focusing specifically on American football. And so I work with athletes, American football, baseball, primarily team sports. And like I said, ranging from 8 to 25 or upwards. So I'm excited to be here.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, we've got a good diverse group. I like having a mix of academics and coaches and everything in between. So I thought a way to start off with, so where this came from is actually this idea. Well, I said it's been asked a lot of times, but we got into a little discussion in a message group about warm-ups. And so what I thought I would start with is asking kind of the general question, what do we feel the purpose of the warm-up? And maybe initially we could focus on the first part of practice or either, but I thought maybe I'd start with you, Tyler, because that's where the discussion was, where we got this idea, and you're the first person I asked. So what was so I know this question obviously has multiple answers, so we can all chip in.
It does.
Yeah.
And I greatly appreciate the invitation to be on, because it's something that I'm probably asked. One of the number one questions that I'm asked as a practitioner is, well, what do I do for the warm up? And the hard part about it, which I think the reason why so many people ask the question, is warm up for what? What is the warm up for? The warm up is in preparation for practice. Is the warm up preparation for the game? Do I want the informational variables the athletes will be interacting with and directly picking up to be similar to what their game will be like, or their match will be like, in order for them to be able to be sensitive to the information they are picking up? Or do I want the warm-up to allow them to just search the landscape of opportunities? For me, learning is about exploring, and I think that we have amazing perceptual systems, and that allows us to maintain contact directly with the world. And I think far too often that coaches in the warm-up specifically, or even if it's just a warm-up for a weight room session, they strip the creativity and they strip those perceptual systems from the athlete, and they're performing rote repetition and the like. And so for me, the warm-up can be for a lot, but I think the warm-up really and truly is about searching and opening up the system degrees of freedom. So perceptual, cognitive, as well as the motor system degrees of freedom, and allowing for that individual to find their way or connect to different information in order to potentially exploit some of those motor system degrees of freedom later on. And that's if it's maybe less specific. And then if it's more specific, then like I mentioned before, making sure that the informational variables are going to be similar. That way that the invitations for action are going to be similar.
Mm-hmm. Marianne, what do you have you would add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that maybe might be interesting is from an adventure sports perspective, there's quite often that we would be working with people that maybe we haven't worked before. So it's not an ongoing, it could just be a short-term intervention. There are also people that by nature of those sports need to be able to be independent when they're out in those environments and performing. So one of the things I think a warm-up also does is allow you as a coach to collect a lot of information about that athlete and their understanding and interactions with their environment. So I quite often, when I try not to put too much shape onto an early warm-up. If it's somebody new, especially an adult, I'll say, you warm up as you normally would. Let me see what you choose to do, and we'll have a reflective discussion about why. That kind of gives me an idea about, one of the key things is, from a safety perspective, are they competent for me to then take into this potentially dangerous environment? That's kind of quite a big one that might be different. Like, yeah, that's okay, or no, I need to reschedule where we go. But also, what type of handcuffs maybe that they have from their previous experience. Am I seeing them sort of funneled into doing things in a particular way, thinking for a particular reason, that's shut off potentially stuff that maybe I want to use the warm-up to like do a bit of unlearning and unconstraining before we go. So yeah, there's other stuff in there, and I also, and I probably think that Nick will pick up on this a bit more, am I seeing good basic coordination patterns? And especially with something like a horse as well and other things, that I'm seeing that their basic coordination, while not constrained, is definitely functional enough for me to add capacity to. So I don't want to load something that I'm thinking, oh, there's a bit of an issue there. Yeah. So I'm choosing to answer this so that I don't, just from like, as a coach, what am I getting from the warm up? It's not just the athletes. I'm going to learn an awful lot. If I set this up really well, it's a real opportunity for me to gather a lot of information that's going to support me.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Marianne, especially if you're working with individual one-on-one. If you have planned some super hard, chaotic, variable practice, and the athlete in their warm-up clearly has some personal issue, and they're like, I think, being adaptive as a coach, that's to diagnose that. I think that's a great point. Nick, I wanted to ask you, maybe you might, I don't know if you have something in mind, but what I wanted to ask you specifically about, because I know you've done some in this area, there's this growing body of research that actually physical exercise and getting the body fatigued actually facilitates motor learning after. Can you talk a little bit about that work and some of the maybe stuff you've done?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I also have lots of questions.
Okay, perfect.
On what's come before me. So I think in simplicity, the warm-up is meant to transition someone from a resting or kind of day-to-day type life to a particular task. And so you're preparing them mentally and physically. And I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that people move in accordance to how they are constrained. And that could be a neurological constraint, that could be a physical constraint. And one thing that I have found, and through my experiences as an athlete, the toughest thing is that providing, from a coach's perspective, enough structure, but also enough autonomy of the individual, because the individual is going to know what they need best, especially when you're dealing with the more elite or experienced athlete. Now, the younger individual, the novice, is certainly a different circumstance. But to Rob, to follow up with your comment, or excuse me, your question, I think there's this kind of optimized level of increasing preparedness, but then not necessarily prematurely fatiguing. And it's this dynamic that could be potentially individualized. It's also different, potentially day to day for the individual. So from a coaching perspective, do we have to always be conscious of that? I'm not sure. But from the perspective of the research that I've done and my colleagues have done, so we've seen a fatiguing task, like just if you were to do a bicep curl prior to what we coined like a proprioceptive task, in which like someone just had to move their arm and they were blindfolded, so they couldn't see. So they were relying upon internal feedback, internal information. And what we found is that the fatiguing task, the bicep curl, the generic fatiguing task, it interfered with someone's ability to understand where their upper extremity was in space. So they had greater error during practice, during acquisition, but also greater error during the retention test, as well as the transfer to the other arm. So it's like, okay, if we can extrapolate that, and whether the study itself can be externally valid, we think that someone's going to have a tough time understanding their body in space if they're prematurely fatigued. So I caution coaches, I caution practitioners, where it's like, you don't necessarily want someone to be fatigued because here are the potential consequences. On the flip side, my colleague out of Taylor University in Indiana, he's led a couple studies with his dissertation work, and he saw that with like calisthenics and body weight type exercise, that there was a reduction in error in two tasks that required kind of a gripping of a handle to match a target arc. And what they found is that these calisthenic body weight type of exercises reduced error. And in particular, to a follow-up analysis, if you look at reaction time being a brain and muscle idea, so central processing and peripheral processing, the effect was on the central processing, the brain's processing. So it seems as if from a reaction time, from a brain perspective, that prior exercise is good. But on the flip side, if it's too much, it could be potentially negative or have a negative effect. And that kind of inverted U is what I'm trying to answer, is to figure out for a particular task and for a particular type of individual, how much is a good warm-up, and potentially then how much could lead to peripheral mechanisms that can potentially interfere with acquisition and how we learn.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great description, Nick. I like that kind of sweet spot idea because, right. If like the way I think, fatigue is a protective mechanism, right? It's dampening the signals you get from your periphery to your brain to control movement for a reason, to keep you safe. You don't want to get there, but if you do it the right way, and I'll use the buzzword neuroplasticity, right? You get this kind of state. So I think that's a really, really good idea. Dave, what are your thoughts about a practice warm up and kind of what you guys try to promote?
So in ice hockey, we run into a little issue of having a certain amount of time that we're available on the ice. So whether it's 50 minutes or 60 minutes. So we try to really stress having that warm up sometime before it and kind of including that within our practice structure. So our practice on the ice might be from 6 to 7, but we really want to say, okay, hey, our warm up's going to start at 5:30, and what are we going to be doing in our warm up to kind of prime the pump? And I really thought like listen to Tyler, Marianne, and Nick. Tyler talking about kind of searching, opening up that perceptual landscape and trying to figure out ways that we're going to implement it within practice. But I really loved how Marianne was talking about kind of the observation piece, so if they're coming in, we're doing a warm up that's trying to prime that pump and they're just not getting it. How can we switch and change what we're going to be doing in our practice, or change our coaching skills, or maybe our feedback or decision making process to help our athletes find that, what we're trying to look for them or what they really need. So, and then kind of the other topic is for us, we range from 6 to, professional kind of ages within USA Hockey, and it's very dependent on our age. So our young is all about physical literacy and trying to get them to move. As our older, it might be a lot more getting a little bit more of a strength aspect of it. So,
yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. And yeah, I think I like some of the things you guys pointed out, Tyler and Mary, about the rote repetition. You see that a lot. Like I was thinking back, I used to do HIIT training classes, and they would go through this cycle of kind of 2 months where they would use the same exact warm-up stretches and movements. And their philosophy is they wanted you, it was almost like prescriptive coaching, right? They wanted you to learn how to do a pigeon stretch, right? And some people like that because they could get better and you stretch deeper every time. You could compare to what you did yesterday. But I think that the exploration, though, point's a good one. You don't when we explore, you're not going to find much if you explore by starting in the same spot every time, right? Right. If you start on the same path at the start, you're probably going to end up the same end of that path, right? You got to start in different places to explore. So maybe we'll go back to you, Tyler. How some of the ideas of how you change things to get this exploration.
I appreciate the question. And before I dive into that real quick, I just wanted to follow up real quick on kind of what Nick and the rest of the group was talking about, how with the brain is embedded in a larger system. And I also think it's probably important to acknowledge like how we view learning and how we view control. And so if we view it from a performer-environment relationship, it's going to be that relationship, that mutuality that exists. And so it's to acknowledge essentially the brain is embedded in a larger system and it's part of the system. And so I just mentioned that because that exploration piece and that search piece is so valuable to me because I want to see how that individual moves. So Marianne's obviously discussing, the ways in which they're able to accomplish a particular task. And so something that you've probably heard a number of individuals say before is, how many different ways can you perform this movement? Or how many different ways can you solve this problem? I view sport as problem solving, and I think that can be shared on both kind of the views of motor learning, but specifically with, I want to see how many different ways you can organize the available degrees of freedom to accomplish said task. And said task may be general in nature, where the task constraints are not as similar as the sport. And then we start to try to layer in some affordances that are maybe shared over a number of sports. So kind of what we were discussing before we jumped on, Dave, with donor sports, or whether they're specific task constraints. And those task constraints are going to be confluent. So the task, the individual and the environment, how that shapes the behavior that then emerges, because we want decisions to emerge in that way as well, to be task and context dependent. So for me, whenever I'm designing a warm up, I don't have a particular way, because I don't have a rote repetition way in which I design it either. So it's who it is that day. It's the way in which they're moving, coming in, their entire interaction, the way they're interacting with one another. I listen for the volume, the noise level of essentially how they're discussing things with their peers around them. Dave, you mentioned physical literacy. I'm doing my doctorate with Will Roberts, and so I'm obviously a big fan of physical literacy, but I think the physical bit is kind of pigeonhole it, and it's just that. I think it's more than that. It's emotional, it's social, the whole psychological bit, the perceptual aspects. So to borrow from one of the things my athletes have said to me before is, I don't want to be perceptually rusty. So that you can take that and move in many different ways. Obviously, they want to be sensitive to the information available for pickup in their sport. So if I'm preparing my athletes in a practice or a game setting, I still may have the first 5 to 10 minutes when they are owning their warm-up, because I want the athletes to have autonomy. And so I know people like numbers. So to give you kind of an example, it may be I'm starting an American football training session. We're starting at noon Central Standard Time. All of my athletes are expected to be there early. And so they're there early. It's 11:50. They have 10 minutes. Own your warm-up, whatever it is that you would like to do in that 10-minute time frame. Now, I will say for the listeners out there, you're probably thinking, what if they've never joined a session with you before? That's okay. I want them to still own that warm-up. I want to see what they end up picking up, what they select. Athletes that then have been with the group for a while, have seen, what other individuals do, have explored that rich landscape. They start to move in creative ways. Maybe I nudge them in certain ways by saying, how else can you do that? How else could you accomplish that? How else could you get over that box? How else could you get under that particular bar? How else could you catch that ball? But I do that in efforts to promote that search. And so after that 10 minutes is up, we then move into the last 25%. And that's how we look at it specifically here at Emergence is now we want it to be specific to the sport and maybe slices of the sport to where the information is scaled. So the complexity is not necessarily as high. Maybe it's a 1v1 dyadic situation where they're just looking to exploit space around them. Maybe they're not even exploiting it. Maybe they're exploring space around them. Interpersonal distances are different. And so I'm helping co-design that with the athlete. So even there, I'm bringing the athlete into the warm-up. We're still in the warm-up. And this would be before we move into the body of the training session. Now, one more bit before I want to turn it over to obviously all of the other bright minds on the call. If we're in a very general session, because I do work with a lot of youth, we have activities that have dodgeballs in them. We use PVC pipes. We move around on boards to constrain maybe the way in which they can go about placing their feet, but we're not telling them how to place it. They're just expected to try to stay on a 2x4, and they have to execute 10 different squats. any way that you feel that you can, but you have to execute those. Or maybe we have a medicine ball, and the medicine ball, we're telling the athlete, I want you to try to catch the medicine ball with your partner as close to the ground as you possibly can. So we're not telling them how to throw it. We're not telling them how to catch it, but we're telling them where to catch it essentially as close to the ground as they can. How many different ways can you catch it that way? So essentially with you specifically, and even with my older athletes, I want to promote engagement. I want there to be that level of communication because I want it to be that holistic type. And then to the points that everyone else on the call is making, that we want that to be a time where as a coach, we're able to observe who they are on that given day. Are there certain motor system degrees of freedom, which are linked with perceptual and cognitive, that are starting to freeze, even if it's a little bit less specific? And why might that be? It's just informative to essentially how I may go into the practice design. And if it's more specific for a particular sport, I may change the activities that we have for that particular day. But I want to turn the mic over because obviously I'm excited about it.
I'll add a point in a second. I like that perceptually rusty idea, Tyler. I think there's this classical effect in motor learning called the warm-up decrement, right? When you go back to the same task after a while, you're always worse, no matter what. It's not physical fatigue. It seems like you have to. I know Schmidt talked about kind of this attentional set. You need to like shift back into this kind of mode. I think in the ecological approach, we probably want to talk about calibration. You need to, always need to calibrate. You're practicing with a different body every day, basically. You have all these micro. Is
kind of
Dave?
That idea of the learning to learn to move with Hawk, and then what David just shared, and like finding as we go, or like Carl Woods and colleagues are talking about knowing as we go in some of their new papers. So I love it. So
every practice session, you got to find this. And I wanted to ask you, Dave, is that part of when you say priming the pump in that 30 minutes, is that getting people, is it more like focused and attentive, and is as well as getting physical warm up?
No, I think that is both. And it depends on the age, right? So kind of what Tyler was talking about, it's all about the engagement early on, trying to just get them moving, because we're in Zoom right now. They're in school online. How can we get them engaged? But even before COVID, that was a kind of a big thing. That was a big thing that we had. And it kind of leads me to the point of thinking about back in coaching and with some professional and college athletes. When I started, kind of the warm-up was a very strict kind of dynamic warm-up. You're doing this, and this as a team. But it has evolved into something, especially in hockey. They love this called sewer ball. They play soccer. They just kind of move around. It's two-touch. And that's what they're doing before practices, games. It's fun. It's engaging. It's a different maneuver every single time. I was awful at it, but it was actually a pretty fun kind of game that it kind of just evolved. And it came from our European type friends that came over from Europe about how big football or soccer is and how that gets them ready for games or practices. And I think at the pro level, but also at the youth level, it kind of got their competitive juices going, right? It's getting them ready to see where they are. Maybe they need to do a little bit extra working on their hips or something before the game, seeing where they are tuned. But as a coach, you're kind of letting them do it on their own.
Yeah, no, I think that's a common, and I know in baseball you see, they play, where you're bouncing the ball around with your glove to the next, making up these kind of games. And Nick or Marianne, do you have any you want to throw in, thoughts you want to throw in now? Marianne, do you want to?
I have plenty. I just don't want to interrupt.
Go ahead, Nick.
Perfect. Tyler, I'm curious. I really like your approach. I love your enthusiasm. I'm curious in your perspective of when I think of self-organization of movement and exploring possible movement solutions. Is there a point in time in which you want to constrain it further? Do you see from a practical standpoint, to me, self-organization doesn't always mean optimized movement. Organization could potentially lead to what we would view from a coaching perspective as, yes, they might be performing the task, but they could probably perform the task in a better way. So my question for you is like, I love the idea of exploring and being less constrained to, like Dave said, and kind of have this fun and enjoyment part. And I think it alludes to, for those that have maybe higher levels of anxiety, that idea of fun and that social interaction can help kind of clear any cloudiness that they're experiencing from a psychology standpoint. But how do you go about allowing freedom, but also trying to optimize, if there is such a thing as a good way to do something, proper form to do something?
Sure. No, that's a phenomenal question. Probably one for the ages, because that's something we've all kind of entertained quite a bit. Just to share a little bit, and this is not specifically within warm-ups per se, but within human movements. For me, I'm a believer of an ecological rationale, that there is a performer-environment relationship, and they're mutually responsible for one another in the way in which we interact. And athletes are picking up invitations for action or affordances based on their action capabilities, and we can increase upon their effectivities that Michael Turby has discussed, which allows for us to essentially potentially pick up different affordances, whether they're gaps that are emerging, the ability to scoot underneath a particular bar, hop over a box, jump something with a horse, different ways in which we can interact with the world. But I think as a coach, for me, I don't think that there's one perfect way in which we move. And so because of that, and I want to allow for abundance, I want that perceptual motor landscape to become wide and also relatively deep. But if it's too deep, then that particular stable solution, which might be a non-functional solution, is hard to potentially destabilize to nudge that athlete towards maybe a more functional solution. So how do I go about doing so? When I'm looking at my practice designer, when I analyze, I do a lot of observational, analyzing of film from our practice sessions, from game sessions. I bring the athletes in. We have kind of reflective type conversations. Not that they need to answer the way in which they moved and why they moved. Their actions, specifically from an ecological rationale, are speaking louder than what they're actually saying. But I still think it's valuable to hear maybe what they may have been sensitive to. That I'm looking to potentially destabilize a solution by adding a constraint, which Rob does a great job of saying constraints are not just limiting or reducing possible options. They also can become informative. They can allow or essentially inform the athlete of ways in which they could move. So if I have identified maybe with the athlete that a movement is non-functional, how do I go about doing that? Something that is looking to lead to injury because they're talking about like potential pain that is existing, or something that is where they're not successful very often. So you have a similar acting problem and they're just continuing to not solve that problem. And that's not to say that it might not be beneficial for learning, because they're still learning as they go. But if they're not solving that problem because they're not catching the ball in traffic in American football, and that's something they're not doing very well in an inside breaking route, well, I will try to destabilize that solution by adding an extra constraint or maybe multiple constraints. They're all confluent with one another. So I might just have a defender enter from a space that is going to be close to where that athlete is going to have to catch it in traffic, so they gain experience, because this experience is still valuable. But it's not the same entry point every time from the opposition. I'm having the opposition enter at different points. That way that there's consequences to shape that behavior. And if I find that the complexity is too much for that particular session, then I may pull a defender out of the space. I may open this space up a little bit. That way it's not confined to how they're having to pick up gaps that may be emerging. Or I might try to promote the search by doing just that, opening up the space. And that's something that Rob talked about just recently. I think it was on Fabian's different research that he's been doing with colleagues, to where that's something that they commonly will do, is open up, or maybe it was Ramos, but they open up space. And so that's what I will do oftentimes. We'll open up space a little bit to decrease the complexity, to allow them to search, because to your point, not everything that self-organizes is in an optimal or a functional type way. How we go about defining that and how we go about looking at the success of a problem is, or the success of the solving of the problem, I should say, is what we're all after. And it's actually specifically what I'm looking to do within my doctorate, is how can I utilize a constraints-led approach and purposefully manipulate constraints in like a constraints type matrix that allows for the representative task design to promote these emergent decisions that allow for successful performance. And I'm not just going on quantitative information because I think that limits us to a lot, as I would imagine most would probably agree. I think that the qualitative type feedback and information is very valuable in how we go about, looking at an interpretive or observational type movement. So I try to destabilize solutions in order to nudge the individual to search for something different. I try to manipulate constraints to allow them to then search that particular workspace. And if we start to see the emergence of functional behavior where they're breaking more tackles, they have more yards after the catch, they have more catches in traffic, they're making more tackles in space. And so those are the things that I'm looking for as a practitioner. And I just have it underpinned by obviously different theories out there, and no hiding it here. I'm a believer in an ecological approach to learning because I want the athletes to be able to be the driver of their movement, because I believe that their perceptions are what's helping drive that movement.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question and answer, Tyler. One thing I would echo kind of it is, one thing I like to say is not all practice sessions and not all parts of practice should be focused on performance. What I mean by that, it's not always about optimizing around performance outcomes, right? Sometimes you should emphasize feel, like Tyler says, when you're emphasizing creativity, you maybe want to tell the athlete, I don't really care if you catch the ball perfectly cleanly every time, right? We're not worrying about outcome so much. We're worried about other aspects of your movement, efficiency, how it feels to you, variable solutions. Obviously, you want optimization in the end, but maybe with the warm-up, we want to focus on these other things instead of having perfect catching the ball perfectly every time and that kind of thing.
Can I add one more thing real quick, Rob?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So an example might be, and this is just in the warm-up itself, but this might carry over because it's a shared invitation that might be in interceptive sports. Mm-hmm. So for our athletes, whenever we say, let's see how many different ways that you can catch this ball. Now, something that I think is misunderstood from an ecological rationale is that some explicit type suggestions can't exist ever. And I don't believe in that. So an example might be if they're catching a dodgeball. Maybe it's to play bucket ball. I know, Dave, I was kind of smiling when you talk about Super Bowl. We play bucket ball. We play attack ball. Sometimes it looks like rugby and netball and football and different games. But they try to catch it in different ways. And they may try to catch the ball further away because that's how they've been taught to catch that ball further away. And I might just suggest to them, see how close you can catch that ball to your body. They're able to go through catching it close to their body. Just to cut to the chase, essentially it being when we start to look at deceptive qualities in athletes, specifically within the sport I work with as receivers, defensive backs they're searching the information space of the upper extremities oftentimes of a receiver as they're moving downfield. And so if the receiver is always telegraphing their movement by giving that information away, maybe their eyes are widening, me catching it later is going to allow for me to problem solve in different ways, but it's also not allowing that athlete to pick up information to guide their actions. So we do that even within the warm-up with dodgeballs and different types of implements.
Yeah, that's great. I have a question from the audience, but Marianne, I thought I would give you a chance to comment. There's a lot of stuff there, but anything you want to add in at this point?
I would definitely support a lot of what Tyler said for sure, and some of that's what I alluded to at the beginning in terms of us being able to see what sort of repertoire of movement solutions they already have and that they're using at that time. And I think also, like I say, recognizing what frame they arrive, what frame of mind, so to use my analogy, is the rabbit bucket empty or is it full? Are they arriving with all sorts of stuff already, which means there's a really small, I can't push them too much. There's a small ugly zone there, as it were, to play around with, or is that kind of quite big? And how can I play with that within the warm-up? But I think to pick up on Nick's point more specifically around that, what you're seeing in self-organization, I think a lot of what we see in a warm-up, especially if it's people we're not working with regularly, might be stuff that they've actually practiced. We kind of do that, it's, last year's technical template. It's old school technique quite often that somebody has spent a lot of time learning, and so their focus is that they're going through this repertoire of a warm-up using solutions that they've rehearsed. And again, so what I would be watching, like Tyler is, and saying, how do I flip that so that I can get them to start paying attention to that perceptual information that's there, to destabilize some of these solutions that they've deliberately learned how to do. So it's not always self-organization that's not optimal. Sometimes it's also stuff that people have learned and they've practiced an awful lot and held on to, and that is, one of the things that may be holding them back, and this, that's something that I then need to address in my session. So.
Yeah, well, that's good. So I have a question. So anyone following along, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, you post a comment, I can see it. I'll post it So the question we have is about warming up under conditions where there's kind of a functional limit in the athlete you're working with, and for example, an injury. Where if you have a hockey player, someone recovering from ACL, do you do anything different with a warm up? Nick, do you have any thoughts about, or any? Also, feel free to comment on the last stuff too.
Yeah, I think one of the really important ideas that we're starting to address here is, from a practice perspective, we can oversimplify at times in an attempt to kind of successively build not only physical skill or mastery along the way, but from a psychological perspective to gain confidence and to feel as if I'm capable of doing something. So the idea of kind of efficacy in a way. But the issue is that life and games and performance type situations come to you all at once. So I like the idea of providing a little bit more freedom and self-exploration to find movement solutions. But Rob, to follow up with your point and to kind of give a real life example, and I'd love to discuss on how to potentially solve this. Like for instance, overhead position in many people is facilitated or assisted via the lower back and the shoulder girdle. Our anatomy, we're capable of getting up overhead without necessarily the inclusion of the lower back. And for me, from an injury prevention standpoint, if we are unnecessarily loading or asking, say, the lumbar erectors to be included in an overhead pattern, is that potentially problematic if we do not address it? So to me, it's like, is there examples, or are there examples for which we need to provide more guidance that, in my opinion, exploration doesn't always provide? And so for me, shifting to maybe more of a weight training form argument, I think if we talk about just getting the arm up overhead, we can get it overhead successfully. But if range of motion comes from a part of the body that may potentially not be needed, or in some people's view, isn't necessarily optimized, how do you frame your approach but still allow for self-exploration to occur? And I think it's kind of two conflicting schools, and I'm curious what the panel's ideas are on this.
Yeah, well, that's great.
And do you understand my point?
Yeah, I think the commenter made a great.
Everybody else jump in.
Sure. Sorry, I'm muted here. Yeah, I think that the commenter actually made a great comment on that. Some coordination before exploration, right? You have to have a safe. You made the idea of maybe you have to have a safe movement pattern before you have a certain form before you can get to start to parameterize it and try different things. So I think that's good.
Yeah, I like that successive arguments, because we're assuming that everyone is at the state of being competent and skilled. And most often, and Dave, I'm sure you can probably comment with the younger crowd, it seems as if coaches exist to provide some type of framing and some advice on potentially how to move. And I think it's important to maybe not necessarily have it 50-50, because I like the idea of self-organization. It's just, if coaches weren't there to provide some refinement, why do coaches exist?
Yeah. And I think Dave, I'll follow up. I don't know if you want to say something different, but I thought, Dave, because you work with play all the way from kids to professionals. Like obviously were different things there, from mastering, getting the basic movement patterns to guys that are, and women that have it all down. Do you do different things with warm up? Also if you have anything about the injury question, but also, so limits based on experience, but also maybe injury. What are your thoughts on that?
So the injury question, I don't have any comments for that. That's probably out of my league, but I'll leave it to the experts.
Yeah.
But for our young crowd, for them to understand, and as a coach, we're there to kind of facilitate and just design activities for them to explore. It's hard because as a coach, we want to give them the best knowledge because maybe we didn't have that when we were growing up and whatnot. And hopefully stepping back and saying, hey, here's the problem. Maybe we can't all our players, and I'm looking at it from more of a team perspective rather than just one person. Maybe we struggle with supporting and moving to our right. Mm-hmm. How can we design an activity in practice, before practice, or for our athletes to figure out moving to the right is better? And that's where kind of putting in maybe some constraints, or maybe, hey, you get more points for scoring on the right side on a particular game, and kind of forcing that. It's tough because we have so many different athletes at different levels and different experience levels, and trying to find that one size fits all, which is not what we want. We need to kind of make it so all our athletes are, in an athlete-centered environment. So it's a tough question of where and how we can design the environment for everybody to take place, and trying to be an architect. I forgot who said it, something about being an architect of the. I think you got it, Rob. I'm lost for words right now.
Yeah. Yeah. But the designer, yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. I think we're getting into, maybe I'll spin this to Marianne, and kind of Nick's question. This is almost getting back into one we did a couple of times ago, fundamental movement skills, right? It's almost getting, do I need to teach you the fundamentals before I let you explore? Marianne, I guess, and that could come into the warm-up too, do I need to teach you some basic movements before I start doing what Tyler's suggesting? What are your thoughts on that, Marianne?
Yeah, I guess, I suppose if you're working with people long term, then your warm-up is going to end up being different. But I'm kind of listening and thinking that if we want our athletes to still move when they're not with us, then at some point we need to start actually creating some confidence and autonomy around what they do. And if we control everything from the warm-up right through to the end of the session, then it makes it really difficult for them to go and do stuff outside of that. And actually, I think the stuff that an athlete will do outside of our sessions will have a massive impact on their learning and their learning and development. But yeah, definitely. And thinking about what a fundamental movement would be is really interesting. What are they? And I know that's definitely, and it's a conversation that I'm really fascinated in, because it's an item that I need to now look at as part of the content that I'm creating for UK Coaching as well, and really exploring how do we, when we're watching, notice if what we're seeing is functional. And I think everybody said that in different ways, whether it's to add load to, is it going to cause problems? I think with Nick's question, I would also say that if, I would question somebody recruiting a part of the body that might not be biomechanically optimal, if it's not causing them damage and it allows them to be more adaptive, then I'm cool with that. I might not necessarily always know for sure, but the more degeneracy that they can have within that movement pattern and the more solutions, then the better.
But does it potentially reinforce, if you don't step in, does it then reinforce non-optimal mechanics in other areas. Like to me, I've heard the word functional a few times, and I'm curious on y'all's perspective. Is for me, I like the idea of transfer, and it brings up a problematic, I guess, industry-wide approach, is that we have a lack of congruence on terms. Exercise psychology can refer to something as one, and motor behavior as maybe another. And so from a functional standpoint, I'm thinking about it, does it transfer to performance? And is that a shared definition?
Mm-hmm. I can share mine. When I use the term functional, I'm thinking, does it allow them to actually succeed in the outcome of the performance? So are they successful in whatever outcome they're looking for, and is it not causing damage? And but if they are using the same, I'm also looking for variability. So I would agree, if they're using the same movement solution that's non-optimal, then they're starting to create a pattern and an attractor to something that will become optimal, and I would definitely want to disrupt that. But
do we have the ability to detect whether it's causing damage? Like I wonder if these like small things that we're doing over time, they elude our ability to detect problematic movement.
I'm going to let someone else answer in a minute.
Sure, yeah. I'm more so just posing tough questions.
I'll give mine, but I'm interested in other people's. So
please.
So I'm happy to jump in. There's been a lot shared, so it's hard to kind of give a. Sorry, Marianne, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'll just finish this bit and then definitely. So if I'm not sure, then I definitely want variability, because I don't want a repetition of something I'm not sure about, or I would definitely downscale it. So if there's a question mark, I'm going to want as much variability as possible, and I'm going to want to reduce the load as a protective mechanism. Definitely. And I'm also, if it's a human, I can talk to them as well. But also, I'm going to kind of, and if it's a horse, if I think about stuff with Kathy, we can kind of look at stuff and go, is there bracing? Is there, can I see some evidence of a protective mechanism coming in from the central nervous system? What are the cues there that are telling me that something's not quite right, even if they're still trying? So is there is the central nervous system downing the power? Is it bracing? Are they freezing degrees of freedom? There's a couple of things in there that I would look at as cues that maybe that's suboptimal. And like I say, and if I'm not sure, I'm going to down the intensity, and I'm going to make sure that we're not repeating. But I'm aware that that's probably a nice simplistic answer from my point. And Tyler's probably going to add loads of really cool stuff to it.
Tyler, do you want?
I don't want to jump in too much.
No, go in. Yeah. Also, Tyler, answer that. And I didn't know if we wanted to. Do you want to show a video of some of your exercise? Because since we're on visual medium, I thought we could show. But feel free to answer your points you had in your head first. For sure.
Yeah, no worries on. I'll try to have it play without there being like a glitch in the. We can kind of get back to the warm up part of it, which I think this is all intertwined together. But to answer it, I guess relatively short, there were a lot of good points shared by all, and kind of to piggyback on what Dave was saying, I think that coaching oftentimes is looked at as just something that's verbal, like just that what the coach is verbally telling the athlete to do, because I have this mental model of this perfect movement that they need to execute, and everyone needs to execute that model. And so because of that, I think that, and I've said this before, like coaching is manipulating constraints. It's having the athlete perform. Like it's a bright, beautiful day here in the Minneapolis Twin Cities area, but what if it was windy outside and I know that my athlete struggles throwing in the wind a bit? Well, I want them to experience throwing in the wind, or if I'm going to change the type of pitch that they're playing on. So some of that isn't, like just, those are just a couple of small examples. I'm not even getting into task type manipulation, but that's coaching. That's coaching itself. So what we're doing is much louder oftentimes than what we're saying and how we're going about it. So that's one piece. Number two, just to answer real quick, there were two other things now I'm happy to show that Greg asked there, Single Blade asked there was, I saw that as Greg is Sling Blade. But anyway, so with that, as my thoughts stand right now, I view coordination and exploration go hand in hand. I think they inform one another. They're entangled with one another. I don't think one precedes the other. I think in order to solve the degrees of freedom problem, we take this back to Nikolai Bernstein and things that Carl Newell shared and all the other bright minds out there, Robbie and a bunch of others, that if we're solving this degrees of freedom problem, and we're putting these into functional units of behavior to coordinate them, I think that we need to allow them to explore. So I think if we try to silo them out, we're not going to be doing justice to our athletes. That's that point. I'll give you this example, and then I'm happy to show the videos. Nick, your question as far as like them being in compromised positions and kind of the weight room piece, phenomenal question. I've been battling with that for about 10 years now. I've looked at people that are rounding back in deadlift, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's not the proper form. But yet they might be there in practice. They might be there in competitions. They don't experience it to a certain extent. They're not going to be able to be very functional with the way they get out of it. But if it happens in a superfluous way, it can be very detrimental. How do we design superfluous? I think that's where the coach-athlete relationship comes in, and the awareness of what their capabilities maybe are. Because skill isn't singular. Skill is a multitude of different things. And so the reason why I say that, kind of going back now, so I'll give you one example from kettlebell training. It probably comes at no surprise for those of you who know me that I teach and work with kettlebells quite a bit. Question I get when I'm traveling the globe is if I have a kettlebell swing. So for those of you like cannonball the handle on it, I'm swinging in between my legs. I think everybody knows what they are now. Sometimes, and it's referred to as an American swing, whenever I'm in China, Japan, wherever I am, and the bell's above the head, and athletes are just borrowing from other joints and able to get in order to get in that position. But they may already have an extremely rounded posture, kyphosis, potentially extremely tight pectoral muscles. So they're already in a compromised position. Now they're borrowing from other joints to get there. It's repetitively happening over and over. So they're solving that problem, but it may end up turning into something, and likely will end up turning into something where now they have issues through their cervical spine. So I'm not just going to go fire away, keep going. I might step in and say, let's see if we can solve this problem in a number of different ways. And maybe I provide a constraint such as a boundary, and they can go any way in this particular boundary, but there's a limitation as far as how high they may be able to go. And that's just a weight room example. So I don't want this to sound like by any means that from an ecological perspective that it's just figure it completely out with no direction. I think that direction comes in the form of constraint manipulation. Let's see if some of these play. Just a couple of these here. I mean, there's let me share my screen first. Share screen. This is a bit different than Zoom that I'm normally on.
Yeah, it's a. Hopefully,
Tyler, if I could just piggyback while you're setting up, I think you bring up a really nice point in saying that we have like this risk versus reward. Now, in my opinion, in sport, someone's not going to be in a kyphotic position with hundreds of pounds of external load in addition to their body weight. So I think in the weight room, we can, because of the external stress, we should be cautious, or at least more cautious about optimized movement because of the external load.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's a very good point. Sorry, I'm hearing you. I was just pulling up what I was.
I wanted to pause.
Are you able to see it?
Yep.
Yes.
So these are just a couple examples, very non-specific. I mean, here it was just the right hand has to stay in contact with the ground, move away from the pipe any way that you potentially can. These are some old ones. Of course, it's going to freeze now. See if any of these will play. So right foot here, just moving, not telling the person exactly how they need to move, but just having them solve that problem in as many ways as possible. Give you some that are non-pipe. People say, well, here's one that's got a bunch of them on there with youth. Now, these kids, to the point of, I think, a handful of you earlier, they've been in sessions with us before, and I apologize for the size of the screen here. But trying to maintain stability on one single leg. Now, there's a number of reasons why we're doing this. They might think it's a core movement or something for their trunk, but it's single leg stabilization, it's engagement. I have it on mute right now, but the level of noise is relatively high. They're excited. They're doing a lot of. They got JJ Gibson there. Sorry for those. I don't have a ton of them, I guess, on this particular one. Let me get out of this real quick. I already clicked out. So let me see if I can go back to Drive.
Yeah, I think that
I X'd out of it a little bit earlier, so I apologize. I only have a couple loaded in this particular one. I was given some examples earlier on the medicine ball, and essentially, like here, it's catching as low as you can to the ground. So now you have, there's that lunge position there that you're trying to teach them to do, but now they're getting a chance to search, and they're lunging in different ways. And these are just a couple examples. Obviously, there's a number of different things. There's a lot of dowel rod ones on this one. Obviously, you're seeing here. There's a couple other ones. This one's real short. I apologize. So now there's expressing strength in different ways, contact, different positions. These athletes are from a number of different sports. Some of them are baseball. Well, oh my goodness, we don't move like this in baseball. Well, you apply force in a lot of different ways in baseball. You also have to communicate. You compete. So there's just elements that exist from a number of positions. Perturbations, disturbance in motion from someone else outside. So they're holding different positions. I guess there's more on here than I realized, but let's see here. So here's a couple of those med ball examples. So just rather than just practicing a single rotation, these different positions in which it's being thrown. Give you one or two more.
So looking at this group, I really, it's like a strength exercise and being physically literate exercise and exploring your environment. Like this is working on their strength, but also working on being able to move.
So Dave, is that you? I'm sorry, I can't see you.
Yeah.
You bring up a very, very crucial point there. For something that we try to express to our coaches and to our parents and to our athletes is that you don't just get strong back here where the weight room is. Strength and power and all those pretty words that people want, those occur in a number of different settings. But all the while, they're getting an opportunity to find out about how they can interact with the world and what they're able to pick up. And yes, stuff here isn't nearly as specific as what their sport is. This would be, a different session. And Rob, you mentioned the word homework at the very beginning of our call. Mm-hmm. Homework, this might be things the athletes are doing, not just in COVID times, but times where they have time before they're going into their activities with their particular teams. I have athletes that play at the professional level in NFL football, CFL. They're doing stuff like this prior to them going into the actual sport itself. This is weight room stuff. Now, before anybody out there has a panic attack about me changing the stance I'm in there, the tempos, one last thing I'll mention, and I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Yeah, I think I took you out there, Tyler.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah, if you want to put it back up, yeah.
You're staring at it as it's going. Yeah. Essentially, we have a key, an exploration key on our cards in the weight room specifically. And I won't go into this in detail. The rest of the team in Emergence will get upset with me because it's in one of our courses. You guys can go check out some of that material. Cheap plug, sorry. With that being said, there's an exploration key. And the exploration key might have a range. So it's not just do whatever you want to do in this particular activity. It may have high loads. It may have high speeds. Well, I don't want that to be a full exploration, do whatever you'd like. I'd like that to be kind of like a middle range or maybe even a low range. But if it's something like crawling or body weight type lunges, or they've been with us for a while, to point out a couple of things that Marianne and others were sharing, like that's where I do want there to be a lot of autonomy there. Because when they're on the field, it can't just be constantly, how do I move? How do I perform? So anyway, all that being said, those are just a few examples.
Yeah, I like those a lot, Tyler. And I think it connects to a lot of points everyone's saying. Obviously part of the warm-up is for injury prevention, right? We don't want people to get hurt in training. And to me, there's some, it's essential elements there, like what Nick was talking. Variability is a protective mechanism against injury, right? It reduces load. And the other thing I always think of is, when do athletes get hurt? Did they get hurt when they know exactly what's going to happen? No, they get hurt when they have to make an unexpected change in direction, right? So doing all planned movements and warm-ups and practice does not prepare, like you're saying, the loads the forces you need to handle. Doing lots of unplanned stuff like you're doing, Tyler, where you're reacting, you never know what movement you're going to end up doing. I think that's important for preparing people handle that in the game. So you're preparing your body and you know to handle those kind of things in the game and preventing injury. I think we're coming up to, that went by super fast. I think we're coming up to around the hour. So maybe I'll give everybody one last comment about, thoughts about the warm-up, way we could change it, anything you want to talk about. Marianne, I'll start with you.
Oh gosh, yeah. I think firstly the warm up is a really good opportunity. Like say I love that perceptually rusty, and I think that goes to the coach as well. So it allows the coach and the athletes and everyone else to just readjust and tune in to what they're doing and what's going to happen. And I think going forward, it's really good not to have something that's like a rehearsed warm up, but something that's linked to what you're going to be doing and allows you to then co-create and be, and make sure that you can adjust that coaching session based on what you see. So really using it in a much more nuanced way, checking in mentally, emotionally, physically, what's going on, and how is this leading into adding more stress capacity during your session that's linked to the warm-up.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Nick, what do you have final thoughts on the warm-up?
Yeah, I think we should value movement over static stretch. I think that quite often I still see that out there, and the literature says that around 60 seconds of static stretching could potentially then reduce power. So I value movement over holding. I value movement that's progressed from potentially slow speed to the speed for which will be applied during the subsequent bout or the subsequent game. And I also think that you also have to ask yourself, what are you preparing someone for? What does the task require? And if time is limited, I would say start first with joint-specific or task-specific type drills that are movement-related, that are constrained by the coach, and then move towards exploration at a speed that mimics what they'll be doing in that subsequent bout. And that's my kind of general rule of thumb is how I would approach it.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah. Dave, what are your thoughts?
Kind of reiterating the point about the perceptually rusty. I think that really brings into for us in hockey on the on-ice warm-up, we have a lot of coaches that want to do just a very block type drill warm-up where it's just working on your left skate pushes or whatever it is. And given the fact that we only have 50 or an hour, how can we get that perceptual system firing as fast as we can on or off the ice? Because we got to hit home runs. Mm-hmm. We're like Spinal Tap, right? Mm-hmm. We got to turn the amps to 11 when we're on the ice. So I think it's a really important thing to make sure that we are giving them all the cues and the ability to our athletes to perform what they're going to perform in a game or when it's a time crunch.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think your point about limited practice time, right, is really, when I posted about this online, a lot of people said they get annoyed about having to waste valuable ice time or field time with people doing stretches and things like that. Tyler, what are your...
Those are great points by all three of those individuals. Very good points, and I would echo a majority of them. I think for me, it's a couple of things. Number one, if it's for specific, practice preparation or the sport itself, I think it's important to have information that's going to be available in their sport to be in the actual warm-up itself, past the maybe early stages of the warm-up. That way that they are sensitive to what they would be needing to pick up in their particular sport to regulate and guide movement. I think that's one point. To now take it even more digestible and something very easy maybe for coaches to take away right away. Pick something super basic, something that you've seen your entire life, a lunge, a skip. And then before you even say anything to your athlete, or before you even show anything to your athletes, how many different ways can you change this skip? Just a skip. How many different ways can you change this lunge? I do this, like I said, I work with kids and I work with with adults and professional athletes, you'll see so many different things you never even would think about doing, directions, tempos, movements, and they enjoy it. So just pick something, start there. Maybe if it's something that you're tentative with, increase the engagement with athletes. Specifically, if you work with a team sport, increase the engagement with the athletes, and think about how you can have problems to solve. And those problems to solve could be, the way in which they are solving it with their motor system degrees of freedom, or maybe it's communicating with one another. That's a key piece for me. And then I think there were some key points that were brought up as far as, and I've heard people ask before that Nick was just addressing, as far as like when you scale speeds of movement. I think that's still a very, very valid point. You're not just going to be right out of the gate, you're full speed trying to elude somebody. That's going to be a recipe for disaster. And then last but not least, I would say just involve your athletes. Involve them. And the athletes can be athletes that can talk to you, or in Marianne and Kathy and a lot of our other lovely colleagues. It could be just interacting with the horse itself to see what that horse comes up with. So those would be my kind of parting words, but I thank you all very much and really appreciate it, Rob.
Yeah, no, those are all great. And I guess what I would add, the warm up is the start, and, where you start is really critical for where you go. And the example I would use, in life, we all have this experience where we struggle figuring something out, and we go away from it and come back and suddenly we get it, right? And I think a large part of that is when we come back, we're in a different spot, right? So I think perturbing where you start in training, I think is so important. Right, starting from different points. I think those examples, like Tyler, when you transition from those different types of movements to this same sports skill you're practicing all the time, I think you're going to get different solutions, I think it's going to be really beneficial. So I think that starting from a different place is really, really important. So thanks everyone for joining us. That was a lot of fun. It went by super fast, and we'll see you next time. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.